We're right on time, Mr. Doar. We're going to start here. This is going to be a great legislative update. You are the hardest working man in politics. This is Rob Doar, who's the political director of the Minnesota Gun Owners Caucus. He's at the Capitol day and night, and we've held things in place for the most part until the next time, which I know you will also talk about. Give a really warm welcome to Rob Doar.
All right. Normally I like to get out into the audience, but because there's a camera, I'll try to tether myself up to the stage here. It's really hard. I'm not somebody who typically over-prepares for a speech, and I like to get out and talk, but I'll do what I can here. Before I get too far into this, I do want to actually invite somebody else up to say a few words. Representative Brian Johnson is here. And I don't know how long he could stay, and I didn't tell him I was going to do this, but he is the lead on the House Public Safety Committee. He was literally our front lines in trying to defeat all of these anti-gun bills that were coming up in the legislature. So I just wanted to give him an opportunity to say a few things before I go on.
Thanks, Rob. This is one of the hardest working people down there. I'm so grateful for his organization. They are the only Minnesota-based organization that's down there full-time protecting your Second Amendment rights. They're there 24, seems like 24/7. In fact, today at the special session at 3, I took a picture at 3:40 a.m. and put it out there. They were still up in the galley watching, making sure what's going on, making sure no funny business happened. Between Minnesota Gun Owners Caucus and some help from the NRA, we did a lot of good things this year trying to stop some of the stuff they were pushing through, both on House File 8 and House File 9. And if you go to their Facebook page, what was the name of that pastor again?
Tim Christopher.
Tim Christopher. You need, if you haven't watched it, you need to watch what he says. He hit a grand slam. He told exactly what the problem is and how these House File 8 and 9 would do absolutely nothing to stop the gun violence. We need to do everything we can to stop the gun violence, but let's do some things that'll work. This past year was very difficult year for me. Last year I was the chair of public safety, and this year I'm the Republican lead. Up until this year when I was unfortunately had to move offices, was the first time Rob Doar has ever been in my office. We were able to do all these things and stop everything, all the stuff they were pushing through. 2 years ago, they used a seldom used House rule and forced the gun bills that they had in committee, forced a hearing on them. And Minnesota Gun Owners Caucus did a fabulous job shutting them down, as they always do. He is the one that's out there going, doesn't matter what side of the aisle you're on, he is going to talk to every legislature. He explains what's going on and what the bills do, what are the bad parts of the bill, what are the good parts. Of course, 8 and 9 didn't have any good parts.
Every once in a while, there's a good part of a bill.
Once in a while. But he worked, and he doesn't out there yelling at them. He's having a very good discussion, educating them. He's not out there screaming out, I'm not going to take these out, have to take my gun out of my cold dead hands. He's actually out there educating, explaining the situation. And in fact, what we did, we actually got something stuck through that they didn't catch until it was too late. In the, I believe it's the Environment and Natural Resources Bill, there is a grant that schools can apply for to teach firearms training and safety in their schools. I don't think they caught that till it was too late. But with that, I'm going to have Rob come back up. Like I say, he is one of the hardest working people down there, and I'm glad he's on my side.
Thank you, sir. Yeah, that was a good one. We had it in there. It was from the Senate side. Senator Justin Eichhorn had the bill, and things were just moving so fast. They're reading through thousands of pages of bills a day. Not that that's a great way to govern, but it did provide us the opportunity to try to get some things that that weren't very objectionable through. I mean, how are you gonna object to teaching firearm safety in schools? This is DNR hunter safety. You say you want people to be trained. You say you want kids to be aware of how to, of gun safety. How are you going to turn down funding it and providing opportunities? So that was great. The funny thing, there was a reporter last session who was writing an article about gun rights at the Capitol and things like that, and it was focusing on me and some other key representatives. And he had asked Representative Brian Johnson, well, how much time does Rob Doar spend in your office? Thinking like I'm breathing down his neck every day, telling him what he needs to do. That's not really my style, but it's also not something I need to do with somebody who just gets it, somebody who gets defending your Second Amendment rights. I don't need to breathe down their neck. I don't need to scream in their face. They're already on our side. The only thing I have to get from talking to them is losing their favor. But he asked, he says, well, how much time does Rob Doar spend in your office? And he says, I don't think he's ever been in my office. And the reporter is just shocked. And it's like, no, I don't need to spend much time talking to somebody who's already on our side. But there was, before session even started, I was down there, and he was moving his couch, and I saw that he needed a hand. So I ran in there, tried to do the nice Minnesota thing, and helped him move his couch. And then he's like, you're in my office. We lost that talking point. But this year being a little bit different, we did need to spend a fair amount of time strategizing and trying to plan the defeat and demise of these gun bills. So before I go too much into kind of what the future looks like and kind of staying with the fall from within theme, I'm going to go over and explain what these bills were that were attempted. I just heard them talking about 16 to vote. Yet they wanted to raise the age to own a firearm to 21. That was in a bill that was introduced. So 16-year-olds are smart enough and responsible enough to vote, but 18-year-olds are irresponsible and dumb enough you're too dumb to own a gun. I thought that was an interesting dichotomy there within their messaging. But it would have required you, House File 8, the initial draft of the version, would have required you to get a permit to purchase prior to purchasing any firearm. So right now, those of you who have a handgun or a scary black rifle are familiar with the permit to purchase process, where you have to go do a background check. That's the same background check that gets done when you buy the gun, and get a piece of paper that says, yes, I had a background check in order to go buy that pistol or scary black rifle. That process is already current law. They wanted to expand that for every firearm, any shotgun you bought, any deer rifle you bought, any other firearm that you would have bought would have needed that special little piece of paper. The other thing with that bill is that piece of paper was good for one firearm. One firearm. So if you wanted to go buy matching 870s for you and your son to go duck hunting, you would have had to wait until you got a new permit to purchase and waited in order to get that. That was the initial draft of the bill. They went through, and the chiefs of police who issued these permits to purchase can deny. It greatly expanded their ability to deny you with no ability for you to appeal. You can take them to court, but if you take them to court, you have to hire a lawyer, you have to file the suit, you have to pay for all of that, and then if the judge ends up ruling in your favor, you are stuck with all of those legal bills. Imagine needing to go get a permit, get denied, and then take a police chief to court every time you wanted to purchase a firearm. That's what was in these bills. Now, they made these bills extremely, extremely bad, and I think that was intended on their part. They knew that they were going to get somewhere closer to the middle if they just started a conversation. That's a big buzzword around the Capitol now. Let's just have a conversation. How about you don't take my rights? There's the conversation. But let's have a conversation. And we just said no. There's no version of this bill that is, one, acceptable, but two, going to have any impact on what you think it's going to have an impact on. And if you ask them, what do you expect these bills to do, you'll get a few different answers. One of the big ones is mass shootings. And they'll say, okay, we need to stop mass shootings. Did you guys know that almost every single mass shooting in recent history, the shooter has passed a background check? They bought their firearms legally. So that throws this out the window. This bill isn't going to stop any mass shootings. Okay, then they talk about suicides. Okay, well, maybe we can really reduce suicides. Now, suicides are 78% of Minnesota's firearms deaths. 78%. That's a huge chunk. Nationally, it's about 66%. We're way over the average as far as that goes. And I think there's some things that we can do along those lines, but the most common demographic of suicides are white men in greater Minnesota who are age 50 plus. That's the most common demographic. Also, people who have owned firearms their entire lives and are not prohibited persons. They won't pass a background check. There's nothing on their record that says that they are a dangerous person. So this isn't going to address suicides. And then they talk about school shootings. That goes into the same thing with mass shootings. And then they talk about gang violence. Okay, well, what about gang violence? Guess what? Gang members aren't going through background checks. It's Representative.
It's illegal for a gang member to possess a firearm.
It's already illegal for a gang member to possess a firearm.
Common sense.
Representative Jim Nash came up with this really great analogy that he asked the author of the bill, who couldn't provide an answer. What does this bill do to stop gang member A and gang member B from going behind the gas and sip? And he loved the gas and sip. I've never heard of that, but that's the gas and sip, and trade in a bag of drugs for a bag of guns. And they said nothing. And it's like, so what are you doing here? And the fact is, the bills that at least House File 8, and we'll talk about House File 9, that's a whole other deal. So this whole idea of universal background checks, that's going to stop mass shootings, false. It's going to keep suicides down, that's false. It's going to reduce gun violence. And I'm going to go on a little bit of a tangent here too. You will hear them say gun violence, as if we're in some sort of an epidemic. Violent crime is down 50% over the last 25 years, over 50%. You guys remember in the 90s when the New York Times was calling us Murderapolis, and they're running those articles? We're less than 50% of what our homicide rate was then. 60% for property crime less, lower than then. The only way that they can use gun violence to the numbers to make it work, to make it look like it's a worse problem, is by lumping in those 78% of suicides. So they lump it all in as if it's one problem. Gang members shooting each other on the street is the same thing that needs the same resolution as the farmer who's had 3 bad years, is divorced, lonely, and sees no path forward. To them, that is the same problem with the same resolution. That is categorically false, and I think it's an insult to those who are suffering from mental illness and suicidal tendencies to think that the same approach for gang members is going to work on them. So anyway, that tangent. But whenever you hear gun violence, I strongly suggest that you don't use that word. Use violent crime. Use gang violence. Use things like that, because when you use gun violence, you're giving into their terminology that suicides somehow have the same resolution as violent crime. I'm going to get to questions in a little bit here. Okay. So the House File 8, that was their idea, that the background checks are somehow going to reduce that. They, of course, won't affect any of that. But what it will do is make gun ownership significantly more difficult for law-abiding citizens who want to acquire a gun. And that is their end game. When we talk about the fall from within, that is what they want to do. They're going to talk about reasonable. They're going to talk about common sense. They're going to talk about rational. They're going to put all of these buzzwords that make it sound like if you oppose this, then you're not reasonable. You're not rational. You're not common sense. You're going to put all of these things out there so that if you oppose this, then clearly you're wrong. And the thing is, the goal is to make it more difficult for law-abiding citizens to buy firearms, because if they can make it difficult enough, then you just won't do it. If they make it hard enough, the next generation who's like, I have to go through 6 background checks, and I have to have a 30-day waiting period, and I have to pay a $200 license, and all of this, they're just going to not do it. It's not going to be worth their time. They're just not going to become gun owners. But then what happens is, year over year, generation over generation, it becomes easier and easier for them to erode our rights away because they just don't care. And that's their long-term goal. And that's something we need to solve. What was your question, sir?
Guns don't commit violence.
Yeah.
There is no such thing as gun violence, because guns are incapable of committing violence.
If I was to pull out my Glock and set it on this table, it would sit there. It would sit there for 100 years. It would turn into a big pile of rust. Well, not the plastic part, the metal part. Into a pile of rust and not hurt anybody. It is not until somebody puts their booger hook on it and decides to do something with it that it becomes dangerous or safe. That is, the gun is not dangerous, it's the individual. Thank you, that's an excellent point.
It's the attempt to personify an inanimate object.
Right.
That's exactly what it is.
Right, and you see that with the terminology for assault rifles and assault weapons. It's to put the scary idea of behind an inanimate object that is statistically less likely to kill you than the thing that brought you to this meeting tonight. You know, so it's
totally indicative of what they do here. Because people have feelings, and they're all about feelings.
Yeah.
They're trying to port feelings to the gun.
Yeah.
It's just nuts.
So that was their resolution. Now what they did is they asked for all of that stuff, and they expected us to try to start horse trading. Okay, well, we'll accept the one permit a month, but you got to get rid of raising the age. They expected us to start negotiating with that, and our answer was just no. We're not going to do it. I had the leader of Moms Demand Action say, well, what can we do about this? I said, not a damn thing. Sorry. It's just not going to happen. There's just no compromise. Now, I am all for looking for solutions, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. I don't want to get too far off track. I'm all for looking actual solutions that will address violent crime, that will address criminals who use firearms, that will address suicide, that will make sure that we have got those resources. I'm all for looking at that, and I'll talk about some of those things in a little bit. But I'm not going to entertain gun control just because it'll make you feel better. That's a stupid way to legislate. Everything that we pass at the legislature, we pass way too much. But we should at least be able to look at it, especially from a criminal justice standpoint, and say, is it enforceable? Can we actually enforce this? And will it have the impact that we expect it to have an impact? Just because we have to hashtag do something, that was literally their hashtag, do something. How about do something practical, or do something useful, do something logical? No, they just wanted to do something so that they feel better. And that's what to do. So they expected us to engage in all of this horse trading and trading of this right for that right, and we just said no. Eventually, they saw through that, and they came back with what the bill that they finally wanted, which was just pistols and semi-automatic rifles. They cut out all of these exceptions. If you're giving it to your father, or father to child, or child to father, father to mother, spouses, grandparents, all of that, not your nieces and nephews, not your uncles, not your cousins. They put all of these exceptions in so that they could have the talking point of saying, well, it's not universal background checks. Look at all of these. You're free to trade it between a family member. Some family members. So they wanted that talking point that no, you can still give your wife a firearm, or give your brother all of that is okay, but you can't loan a firearm to your neighbor that you've known for 30 years unless you went through this background check and this permit process. So I wanted to expand on that. How many of you have heard 90% of Minnesotans support universal background checks? How many of you have heard that statistic? So that question comes from a Star Tribune poll of 470 some odd respondents. And the question that was asked was, do you support criminal background checks on all firearms sales? And so 90% of people said, yep, sure. Why not? That sounds, that's reasonable. They didn't say, do you think that you should have to go through a waiting period, get a permit, keep a piece of paper that if you lose any time in the next 20 years, you could be charged with a gross misdemeanor just for loaning your firearm to your neighbor? They didn't ask that question. But they try to say 90% of people support this bill. 90% of people support H.R. 8, so that the House and Senate have to pass it. And it's just categorically false. The question that was asked to, when you look at actually the breakdown, they even say that it oversampled the Metro and it oversampled Democrats. So there's one thing. But it also, it didn't indicate whether they actually knew the current process. The question may as well have been, do you think that the current process is okay? And that may have been the question that the people think they were asking. So that's my other thing. I said, well, one, don't fall for their terminology. Two, don't fall for their premise of the statistics. If they say 90% of people support this bill, say, well, show me. Show me when this bill, the text of this bill was presented to people and 90% of them said yes. Because it doesn't happen. The state of Maine, universal background checks leading up to going on a ballot measure. Thank God we don't have ballot measures here in Minnesota. I don't know if you guys are fans of ballot measures or not. We would get completely screwed, and I will fight with you on that any day. Not right now, I'm on stage. But we can fight over that if you think ballot measures are a good idea. But in Maine, they have ballot measures. And so there was polling that said 90% of people in Maine wanted universal background checks. So they put it on the ballot. Guess what? It failed, 55 to 45. It failed. So where was that 90% of people? No, they were given the specific text of the bill, and they looked at it and said, nope, not a fan. And they may have been supportive of the current process where if you go to an FFL dealer, somebody who's engaged in commerce of selling firearms, that they have to do a background check. They may have supported that. But when the actual text of this says, hey, you can't loan a gun to your neighbor, they said no. The state of Nevada, they have ballot measures. They passed it. It was 50.5% to 49.5%. It passed. So this whole idea that 90% of people support universal background checks is just completely misrepresentation. Because the question that's asked is never there. But anyway, that was their one of their big pushes. The other big push that they're working on is red flag firearm confiscation. Red flag bills. Let me tell you about red flag bills. How many of you, I'm not going to ask you any follow-up questions, but how many of you have been through a divorce? Okay, no follow-up questions, I promise. But rhetorically, how many of you don't have to raise your hands, know somebody, whether it was yourself, who had a divorce that wasn't necessarily very friendly or very amicable? I don't need to see your hands. I don't need your personal problems. You all know that. What red flag firearm confiscation did was initially allowed any family member, any member of law enforcement, any county attorney, or their designee, so essentially anybody, to go to court, make a statement that they are in fear of your possession of a firearm. They fear that you are a danger to yourself or a danger to somebody else. The judge looks at it and says, okay, we're going to issue a red flag order. Law enforcement comes, shows up to your house, knocks on your door, says, hey, Tom, I know that I just need to let you know that Susie has put out this red flag firearm order against you, and you're not allowed to have any contact with you, and I need you to hand over all of your guns.
They wouldn't even tell us if it was Susie.
You don't even know that an accusation has been levied against you and the sheriffs are showing up to your door asking for your firearms. That's red flag firearm orders. Now, the way that they sell it, of course, with all the butterflies and rainbows and unicorns, is, well, we need to make sure that we keep guns out of the hands of domestic abusers and those who might commit suicide or a mass shooting. So let's think about that. The logic behind this is that, okay, I'm worried that this person is going to commit suicide. So I'm going to go and get this red flag firearm order. Law enforcement's going to, judge issues it because what judge wants to get that wrong? What judge is not going to err on the side of caution in that situation? You got a family member or law enforcement saying, hey, I'm worried about Tom here. He's got a bunch of firearms and he's been talking about taking his own life. The judge goes, oh God, well here, sign it and go get him. They show up to Tom's house. Tom is in a bit of a rut. Maybe he's been laid off, or maybe he's one of these farmers we talked about who's been having a few bad years, a couple bad seasons. And all of a sudden they show up. Hey, Tom, we've got this red flag firearm order. Some people are worried about you. So we're going to go and take your firearms, and then we're going to go. Good luck, sir. Bye. Leaving all the knives in the kitchen, all the medicine in the medicine cabinet, the rope in the shed, the car in the garage, the quarter-ton pickup, all of these other things. The majority of suicides in Minnesota don't happen with a firearm. They happen with something other than a firearm. Yet we think that Tom is suicidal, so therefore, if we take his guns, he no longer poses a danger to himself or a danger to anybody else. That is completely just asinine thinking, that somebody is no longer a danger. One of the things that they pointed out about this as well, firearm suicide rates went down in Connecticut after they passed this bill. So I go and I hit the Googles and I look up all of the numbers, and I was like, okay, let's look into this. So they're saying, well, after red flags were passed, firearm suicide rate in Connecticut went down. And I found out, okay, that's true. It went down 0.5%. But did the suicide rate go down? No. The suicide rate in Connecticut, as well as every other state that has passed these bills, has been going up. Even the raw number of firearms suicides went up in Connecticut. The rate went down because more people were committing suicide by other means. So that's a little complicated, but basically, the number of firearm suicides was unaffected by the red flag order. More people just ended up killing themselves with things other than guns. More hangings, more running the cars in the garage, more cutting, more pill overdoses. They outnumbered the rate. In 2017, Connecticut they passed their red flag law in 2012 or 2013. 2017, they had their highest suicide numbers ever. I don't think that it is something praiseworthy to say, well, yeah, more people are committing suicide, but at least they're not doing it with a gun. Why is that something to pat yourself on the back over? It's absolutely ridiculous. So again, we have to be well informed. We can't give into their premises of these arguments. So I was able to point all of that out in committee, that these bills just aren't going to do what they think they're going to do. Yes.
Was it true that you didn't even have to be a state resident to make a report?
You had to be, you didn't have to be. The qualification was that you were a household member. So what qualified you as a household member? You didn't have to be a resident, but this one's good. You had to be somebody who lived in the same house, somebody who is related by blood, related by marriage, somebody who you are the child or the parent of, or are presumed to be the parent of, or anybody who you've ever had a significant romantic or sexual relationship with, ever. All of these people could have filed for this red flag order. So yeah, your prom date from high school that you got a little handsy with, 20 years later could go in to file a red flag order against you under this bill. So, Representative.
Now, I never got an opportunity to actually ask this question, but I was wondering, now if somebody got a red flag order on, let's say, myself, and my son also and my wife has firearms in the household, they come to take my firearms by the order. They take my sons and my wife's as well, and what would be the process for them to get them back?
Yeah, and that question wasn't answered. They couldn't answer it, and they just said, well, we maybe wouldn't. I don't know. I guess it's up to the department. Yeah, everybody in the house could have lost their firearms, your roommate, and we had somebody testify to that fact. There's nothing that protects me from having my firearms seized because my roommate got a red flag order against him. And that's absolutely true. I mean, I could spend the next hour going line by line of this bill and telling you everything that was bad about it. One thing I want to do, though, is I want to tell you what tools do we have in current law to address these situations. Because the drum that we beat all the time is, one, enforce current law. Is that some ground-shaking position? Maybe before you pass a new law, why don't you try enforcing the one that you've got and seeing if that works? Let's give that a try. During testimony, we pointed out that, actually Representative Johnson pointed out, that in the past, since 2013, there have been 0 prosecutions for somebody knowingly providing a felon a firearm since 2013. That is a gross misdemeanor crime, and there have been 0 prosecutions of it. What did Hennepin County Attorney Mike Freeman respond to that? He said, well, the penalty's too low, so we don't bother prosecuting it. Am I wrong? That's exactly what he said on the stage, on the stand. And so what do? We come up with a bill. Representative Peggy Scott offers it and says, okay, well, Hennepin County Attorney Mike Freeman says the penalty's too low. Let's bump it up to a felony. And we're talking about knowingly providing a gun to somebody who you know shouldn't have a gun. You know that they are a prohibited person, yet you decide to hand them that firearm anyway. They have to prove that you know that they are a prohibited person. So we said, well, if Hennepin County Attorney says, he said, if you raise the penalty, we will prosecute this. So we said, okay, challenge accepted. We put the vote up on the House floor to raise the penalty, and who voted it down? All the Democrats voted down the raising the penalty. So we have a county attorney saying, the penalty's too low. If you raise the penalty, then the juice is worth the squeeze, and we'll prosecute it. And then we say, okay, let's do it. The Democrats, who are the anti-gun Democrats, who are up there saying, we need to do something. We need strong action. So we say, okay, why don't we take the repeat violent felons who are responsible for the vast majority of violent crime? Let's say if you give them a gun, you should be charged with that. Novel idea. And they said, no, that doesn't go far enough. They want to infringe upon your rights. And that's they're not going to stop, and that's what all of these bills do. So that's the unfortunate part of this. So we had that. Yes, ma'am.
So I think a problem that we have in Minnesota is we have the opportunity of our legislators to put in a bill, omnibus bill, all of these things that they want, which, correct me if I'm wrong, it's an illegal action on the part of legislators to lump everything. There's supposed to be one-issue bills that are passed, not everything.
The report is rule that as long as they deal with that department, not the way to do it.
So yeah.
But it's a law.
It's in the Constitution.
So yeah, the Minnesota Constitution has what's called the single subject rule.
Right.
That says any bill that comes before the legislature has to address one subject, and that subject has to be addressed in the title. So here's what they do, and this will blow your mind. They can have a bill, and they have done this, where the title of the bill is literally 3 pages long. And as long as the section that's being talked about is mentioned in the title, that's considered a single subject bill. And our Supreme Court, the Supreme Court of Minnesota, has upheld that. People have sued over this. And it has gone to the court, and the court has said, well, as long as it's in the title, you're good to go. We have had bills that have had 3 or 4 page titles. And as long as it's so, I'm with you on that. That's unconstitutional. But as long as the Supreme Court of Minnesota thinks it's okay, we're not going to get anywhere on that argument. So that's a good point. In any case, one of the great things that happened this session is Senator Paul Gazelka, who said very early in the session, he came to our rally, which had over 1,000 people there, and I know some of you guys were there. He came to our lobby day where we had 600 people out lobbying their legislators throughout the course of the day. Fantastic events if you guys make sure that you go to the next ones. And then every opportunity on our podcast, on our live videos, before the media, he said there's not going to be any gun control this year. And he held firm to that, and he stuck with that. But he challenged the House. He said, if you guys pass it off the floor, not in an omnibus bill, if you guys pass it off the floor, we'll hold committee hearings in the Senate, which is what you want, right? You want committee hearings. The reason why they don't want to do that is because there are greater Minnesota Democrats who don't support these bills. There are greater Minnesota Democrats that voting for these bills just up and down, just cleanly for the bill that's up there, would cost them their election. And we would make damn sure that it costs them their election next year. And so what they do is they bury it in an omnibus bill. And then you got a bunch of reasons why you can say, oh, well, I didn't support those provisions. I would have voted. You go back home to your district and say, oh God, I don't like those parts of the bill. Oh, but we had all this money for our district, for our prisons, and we had money for the sheriff's office, and I needed to vote for that. And all of your constituents say, oh, thank you for the money. And you can convince them that way. But Senator Gazelka, he knew, he said, pass them cleanly off the floor and we'll give you your committee hearings, which is brilliant. It was a brilliant play because it puts them on their heels. It put them on the defensive. They were whining that the Senate was taking inaction. The Senate wasn't going to do anything. And the Senate said, no, you come up with what you want and we'll give it a full discussion. For those of you who weren't paying attention to the last election cycle, we went from having 77 seats in the House down to 54, as far as the Republicans, when I say we. And we're a nonpartisan organization. I personally, am more Republican libertarian leaning. But we, organizationally, with my gun owners caucus hat on, anybody who supports our gun rights, we support them. Anybody who opposes them, we oppose them. It's pretty simple. But we had a huge swing from a very solid pro-gun majority in the Minnesota House to being 18 votes behind. 18 members, 9 votes behind. And when you looked at where they picked up those seats, if I put up a map, if I said, okay, here's a map of Minnesota, and here's where we lost the 18 seats, you would all squint and be like, where? I don't see it. Because almost all of them were in the metro area. You got to zoom in on the metro area, and you will see Eden Prairie, Plymouth, Shoreview, Mounds View, Arden Hills, Spring Lake Park, Chanhassen, Minnetonka. All of these cities are where we lost. Woodbury, Oakdale, where we lost Republicans. And that's what I'm going to get into on this next part. Here's their long game. They know that in the metro area that these gun control bills, these 2 bills, are something that they can use to try to get a victory in 2020. I have a question for you guys. How many of you would be very upset if surfing times in Chicago, that doesn't make sense. I don't know how good the surfing is on Lake Michigan. Surfing times in California were limited or eliminated altogether. How many of you would be very upset by that? Okay, I'm guessing there's not a whole lot of surfers in the room, right? The same thing happens when we're talking about infringements on our gun rights, especially in these metro areas. When you tell them that their gun rights are under attack, they don't care because they don't own a gun. They don't shoot guns. Maybe they're not anti-gun, but if you go up to them and if you put money into putting mailers in their districts, and if you have all these nice moms in red shirts knocking on their door saying, oh, we just want common sense gun control. Okay, yeah, that makes sense to them because they have no personal stake in it. They're not losing anything. None of their rights that they care about are under attack. So it doesn't really register with them personally. And so when we go and we go into these areas and we say, your gun rights are under attack, and they're like, okay, I don't care. Okay, well, but what about your constitutional rights? It's not, how often do you worry about soldiers being quartered in your house? Probably not very often. That's the Third Amendment. So if you don't exercise that right, it doesn't mean anything personally to you. And that's really what's going to be our fall. As they grow these areas out in greater Minnesota, out in the metro area, where it's becoming more and more population dense, fewer and fewer gun owners as a slice of the population, they are going to capitalize on that. The threats that we have, there's a local group that's called Protect Minnesota. They're an anti-gun group that's fairly active. They're not remarkably well funded, but most of their funding comes from the Joyce Foundation, which is an anti-gun organization out of Chicago. And they make a lot of noise. They're in the media a lot. Then we also had the Gabby Giffords new group. Gabby Giffords was the Arizona congresswoman who was shot in the head, started a gun control group. And they're active during the election cycle. They spent $2 million on ads trying to kick out Jason Lewis and get Angie Craig in, among other House races. The big threat that we have is from the group Moms Demand Action, which is funded by former New York Mayor Michael Bloomberg. And here's what they're doing, and it's a rather genius way to approach it. They are taking moms. And typically they're moms who they're empty nesters or retirees, things like that. They don't have PTA anymore. Maybe book club isn't meeting, and they're turning it into social gatherings where they show up at people's houses. They drink wine and they have these discussions and they talk about gun control. And it's turning into this big social movement where, literally, and I tell you guys, the first day of the Capitol session, Moms Demand Action had a rally at the Capitol. And I was sitting down in the cafeteria that's in the basement of the Capitol. And a few of the Moms Demand Action people, one gentleman and two females, came and sat down at the table. They didn't know who I was. So they're like, oh, can we sit here? I mean, yeah, by all means. So they're talking about why they're there and all the gun control stuff, and I'm just, oh, okay. So they finally ask, well, what do you do? And I say, I lobby for gun rights. Their faces, they lean back in their chairs and their faces turn white. I said, no, it's fine. We're having a delightful conversation. So why don't you guys tell me what problems you think that this is going to solve? And they say, well, here's what we're trying to solve. And they're just so thoroughly uninformed on the issues. They're uninformed about current law. They're uninformed on the issues, and they just don't know. I just realized I think I didn't go back and talk about the tools that we have already for red flag laws. This just jogged my memory, so I go off on tangents a little bit. Sorry. Yes, ma'am. Red flag laws right now in Minnesota, and this is what I told them when they were trying to sell me on red flag laws. I said, okay, in Minnesota, if you have a domestic violence situation and an officer believes that domestic violence has occurred within the last 72 hours or is imminent, that they are directed to make an arrest. There is no citation possible in that situation. It's one of the few shall arrest scenarios in Minnesota statutes. And that's one of those instances. You have to make an arrest. There is no other option. So for the domestic violence situations, you're arresting the perpetrator of the domestic violence. For somebody who might be committing planning a mass shooting or planning on committing suicide, we have what's called 72-hour holds. 72-hour holds means that law enforcement can place you on a hold at a hospital if they believe that there is a significant likelihood that you pose a danger to yourself or to somebody else. They can bring you to a hospital, you undergo a medical evaluation, the doctor can determine whether at what point you're recovered or if you need further treatment. What's great about those two portions of law is you're actually addressing the person in crisis. You're not going in, kicking down the door, taking the guns, and believing that you're actually resolving the problem. You're actually addressing the person in crisis. One, you're getting the abuser out of the house and giving that victim opportunity to get help. The second one, you're taking the person who is in crisis and getting them somewhere where they don't have the knives and the rope and the cars and the guns and the baseball bats and the glass and all of that stuff. And you're getting them the help that they need. And they just looked at me and they just had no idea. They had no idea what current law was. So they're so uninformed, but they built this whole social movement up, where you've got all these PTA moms and they all gather up and they have their wine and then they go to the Capitol and they do their door knocking. It's become just their little social circle, and it's incredibly effective. It is incredibly effective, especially out in these suburban areas.
It's hard. All of us are politically minded, so I always say, how in the world do we message in areas like CD4 and CD5 then on this issue? However, is there some sort of unexpected safeguard against our fall from within by supporting high school trap shooting? We're getting guns back into the homes again.
Yeah, the Blaine trap and skeet team have been just rock stars at the Capitol. Those of you guys who follow us on Facebook or Twitter or on our emails, you guys will know that. We actually did a fundraiser for them, and we just raised $1,300 for them, so that they were very happy to receive that. But that is a good in, because we have kids in high school who have never shot a firearm before, picking up, and by the end of the season, getting 22, 23, 24 out of 25 on a trap round, and they are loving it.
And girls are good at this. You can even have a disability and do well in this sport, so you can support this.
Yeah, in the trap teams, when they compete, there is no men's and women's. There is no boys and girls. It is trap shooter against trap shooter, and the girls love it because they're competing at the same level. There's no handicap. It is your skill versus my skill. Also, 0 injuries. 0 injuries, 0 hospital visits in the how many 8-9 years that trap has been running in Minnesota. Fastest growing sport. There is a great opportunity there in order to grow that. And as we talk about that, I just think we need to be mindful of looking for those opportunities. And I think every person in this room, if you care about your gun rights, you have a responsibility here too. When's the last time you took a new person to the range? When's the last time you shared the love of pew pew with somebody else? You know, and sometimes you have to shell out $15 for a box of ammo just to let them get it. Bill's Gun Range has ladies' night. You know, it's relatively cheap, $5 gun rentals. You know, bring somebody there, but share that love of the pew pew with other people. Otherwise, it's going to die. And that's just it. You have to be able to get other people interested in this. You have to make it so that they have a personal stake. And even if they don't become shooters, they don't become gun owners, or whatever the case may be, there's still some other things you can do. When you hear somebody talking about why they support gun control, here's typically what I have found. They support gun control because they believe it will reduce one of the 3 that I talked about before: mass shootings, school shootings, and reduce suicides or violent crime. So one of the mass shootings and school shootings are kind of the same thing, but that's what they're actually concerned about. It is one of those 3. So then you can open up a dialogue. Okay, well, I understand that you want to keep our kids safe at schools. I share that goal with you. But every single mass shooter has passed a background check. So I think we need to think beyond that. Some of the things that we've worked on, school security assessments, actually getting a professional auditing firm, somebody who does this, who as a professional service, goes and looks at buildings, Fortune 500 companies down to churches, and says, okay, here's what you need to do to make your schools safer. We supported that bill. We supported additional school levy funding for security enhancements. Things like just make people come in and out of one door. That makes a huge difference. Have people check in. So have one door, they check in, and then you have another door. Another thing that makes a huge difference. And you know what? Those protect our kids from all potential threats. Whether it's a disgruntled parent in a custody dispute trying to come and get their kids out of the school. Whether it's like my school, which has gone on lockdown, my kids' school, which has gone on lockdown 3 times because a mental health patient has wandered off of the ward at the Alina Hospital 2 blocks away. So all of these potential threats, we're keeping our kids safe, not just guns. You can win them over by having these conversations. You say, you know what, I want to keep our kids safe, but I don't think that just stopping guns is going to do it. I want to keep them safe from anything. I want to keep them safe from all this. You're having this dialogue, and you can win them over on this issue by spending a little bit of time. Now, yes, it feels good to walk into those conversations, draw my gun, and say, from my cold, dead hands. Feels great. Shall not be infringed. It's on the back of our T-shirts. Where's David? He's got our T-shirt on. It feels real good to say that. But if I just go in and that's the extent of my argument, if that's the extent of my ability to try to convince you, what's that going to do? What is me running up and yelling in your face and screaming at you and getting you on Facebook Live and saying, oh, you're a rabbit, you're a crazy anti-gunner, aren't you? Whose mind gets changed in those situations? How many of you have ever had somebody yell in your face loud enough to where you were like, you know what, you're right. God, that was a great point. My position has changed. So it takes a little bit of work. It takes a little bit of effort on your part getting educated on the issues. But that is what is going to save us. We need to expand our culture. We need to make sure that we are countering the lies when we see them, and that we are supporting those efforts which will help people get a better understanding about why the Second Amendment is important to us and why it matters.
Does it help at all to have facts at all, like back in the 20s, the school violence where a man went and killed more children in school back then with dynamite?
Yeah, Bath, Michigan.
Yeah.
So having some of these facts is great, and if you guys go to our website and go on our Facebook page, we have a lot of this. We don't have a whole playbook that we publicize because that would be kind of dumb. But if you guys need specific facts on your tables, everybody's got a brochure. This is our little brochure. If you guys, this will be my only membership pitch here. If you're interested in becoming a member or at least signing up for our email list, you guys can break off this portion here and hand it to me tonight. I would be glad to get you set up. But there's also our contact information on the back there. If you say, hey, Rob, what are some facts that I can use about school shootings or suicides or all of the above? I'll give you some things that you can use as quick talking points. But I testified to my closing line of my testimony before the Public Safety and the Judiciary Committees was the deadliest attack on a school wasn't done with a firearm. It was done with a bomb. The deadliest attack on an entertainment venue wasn't done with a firearm. It was done with $5 worth of gasoline. Happyland Fire in New York. The idea that these bills are going to address mass shootings, address suicides, address violent crime is just a fallacy. But what is significantly more likely to happen is that a good law-abiding citizen is going to get tripped up on a paperwork mistake and end up a criminal, while the criminals who are already circumventing the process continue to roam free.
2 questions. What is your website?
Gunowners.mn, like Minnesota. Gunowners.mn.
And you also have a very analytical, legislatively trained mind. Can you tell us a little bit your background? It's pretty impressive, and very few people know.
Oh, well,
Your training, your education.
Yeah, well, I don't have a very impressive education. My degree is in cross-cultural studies, and I've got an associate's in law enforcement as well. But I do a lot of volunteer work. I've been working, I've volunteered as a incident commander for search and rescue operations for Civil Air Patrol for a long time. I've been a disaster responder for the Red Cross. I've responded to Katrina, I've responded to Sandy, I've responded to other things. But most importantly, what I've learned about the legislature has come from 10 years of hard work. I spent 8 years down there under the tutelage of Professor Joe Olson from Hamlin School of Law. If you guys have a permit to carry in your pocket, you can thank him for that. He's the guy who made that happen. That 8 years down there, prior to becoming full-time with the caucus, really gave me a lot of insight and a lot of clues into how the legislature works. So I don't have a fancy degree, I don't have a law degree. I could spar with the best lawyers on at least those 8 pages of the law that have to do with firearms rights.
No, you're the right man in the right place, and we appreciate it. Do you want to take a few more questions?
Yeah, anybody else have any questions?
I'd like to use the microphone if we could.
I'd like to go back to the taking somebody out of the situation who may be violent. Could that just be an accusation by a family member that had a bad argument with this person and then they're hauled off to a hospital? And
Yeah, absolutely.
which then goes on their record, right?
That's a funny one. So the great question. So the question is, if somebody makes this accusation and it's false, what happens? So let's say you guys go to court. First, they take the guns. That's what's happening first. Your Second Amendment guaranteed property is taken away. Then later on, if you so choose to hire a lawyer and ask for one, you can get a hearing to contest the red flag order that's been issued against you. Let me say that again. After your property has been seized from you, you can hire a lawyer and contest the fact that your property was seized from you without a warrant. There's like a Fourth Amendment or something that every person has a right to be secure in their person, places, papers, effects, houses, without you. And the Fifth Amendment that you're guaranteed due process. What about that? Anyway, so what happens is, let's say it turns out to be all just completely made up. You get, theoretically, your guns back, but let me tell you, there are police departments out there that regardless of how a gun came into their possession, they will hold it for 6 months to 2 years for ballistics testing, just to see if that gun matches any other guns that were used in a crime. If you don't believe me, ask the city of Bloomington. They were just sued for this, as was the city of St. Paul. So you theoretically get your property back. And that person, if you can prove that they were lying, is guilty of a misdemeanor. A misdemeanor. They have upended your life. They have cost you money. They have possibly cost you your job. Do you guys know that if you have a security clearance or if you're in law enforcement and you get one of these orders issued against you, you have to notify your superior immediately, and you have a significant likelihood of losing that security clearance, and you have to go back and get it again if you're even eligible. People could lose their jobs over this, and the person gets a slap on the wrist. That was another one that we had an amendment on the floor that said, hey, you know what? This is pretty bad. If somebody does this maliciously, and that's actually what it says, if they get a red flag order maliciously, and knowing that the information was false, that it's a misdemeanor, we said, hey, let's bump that up a little bit. Let's make that a gross misdemeanor because they're completely upending your life. So maybe that they should have a little bit more skin in the game if they believe that somebody needs to have their guns taken away. And they said no. The Democrats, again, the anti-gun Democrats all said no because, we don't want law enforcement officers to be at risk of a gross misdemeanor charge if they issue one of these orders. So they are okay with law enforcement maliciously and knowingly giving false information to get one of these red flag orders. Oh God, we don't want to charge them with a misdemeanor. Absolutely ridiculous.
My question is, at that point, continue on your topic, is there civil recourse? And is there any kind of history on that for the affected person?
There may be civil recourse. Since we don't have the law, it's kind of an untested aspect. There is no guarantee of civil recourse. I'd argue it was kind of the other way. The fact that they made it a crime to knowingly to do a misdemeanor, that would suggest that unless they were charged with that crime, or unless you could prove through a preponderance of the evidence that they knew it was malicious. And how do you prove that somebody knew something was malicious? You just can't. You have to dig into their brain, unless they sent you a text that said, I am going to get a red flag order against you. I know you didn't do anything wrong, but I don't want you to go hunting next weekend. Unless that's the situation, I have a hard time seeing how you could get any civil remedy out of that.
Thank you, Rob, for everything. What's next for next session?
So next session, they're going to come back again, and they're going to try these bills again. Next session, I think it's going to be all about beating up on the Senate. There's a couple of senators who have stood firm for your gun rights that they know are at risk. People like Paul Anderson out of Plymouth, people like Karin Housley out of the Stillwater area. They're going to be targeting them because right now we have a 2-seat majority in the Senate. Started the session with a 1-seat majority. We helped get Jason Rarick elected, as did some of you in this room, so thanks for that. So now we had a 2-seat majority in the Senate, and they want that Senate seat. Now imagine if we don't win next election year, Democrat, extreme, rabidly anti-gun Democratic House, a Senate with a Democrat majority, and then Tim Walz, who used to run around in his NRA endorsed Tim Walz hat, but then it's like, oh crap, in order to get elected in Minnesota, I have to appeal to all these crazy, hyper left-wing people. What do I need to do? Oh, can't like guns anymore, so let's ban everything. He will sign that faster than the ink will dry on his pen. So. He'll do that very quickly. So next year they're going to beat up on the Senate, but you guys, we're going to need all hands on deck in the Senate in the elections next year. I don't see a path forward to us getting the House back. There is a slim chance. I think depending on how our economy is doing and how things are going at the federal level, we may have a chance to get the Minnesota House back. But if we don't keep the Senate, we are looking for some hard times. And keep in mind, too, that whoever wins the next election gets to pick the redistricting lines. So.
Trump is going to have a big presence here next year, so they're planning on being here.
I have a question. It requires some conjecture on your part. The guy who's on the House and Senate every day, you're probably in a good position to do that. What do you think the motivation is for the left on this issue?
That's a good question.
Is it simply that they feel legitimately that that's the solution, or is it potentially something else?
So that's a complicated question. The question is, why is their motivation? Why don't they like guns? And it's broad, but I think there's kind of two or three categories that I've seen people fall into. One is they are just uninformed, and they've been told that these bills are going to resolve all of these issues. Even the frequency of mass shootings is not any higher than it was in the 90s. I don't know if people realize that. Adjusted on a per capita basis, we got a lot more people living here now than we did that long ago. And even in the United States, we're not even in the top 10 for the deadliest mass shootings. Like, as far as like what happens around the world, we're not even there. But you think, based on the news coverage, that it is an epidemic. You know, that it is something that's you can't turn around without a mass shooting happening. And then that's just the way that it's been presented. So there's some people who've just been told these bills will help this, and they believe it. Some people have this idea of like a utopian society where firearms are icky, they're uncivilized, they're dirty, they're gross. We just need to get rid of them. Those are kind of like your Michael Bloombergs, and that's why he's spending tons of money. Bloomberg spent over $2 million last election on just the Minnesota House. That is a crazy amount of money. And then there's more money from their 501c3, which we have no idea about, 501c3 and c4. So the other ones, there's this utopian society thing. Bloomberg doesn't want anybody eating large pizzas or drinking large sodas or owning guns, because guns are icky, they're uncivilized. Let's all just, become better people, and then we won't need guns. So there's that aspect of it. And then there are people who just hate guns. They just hate guns. They want guns, all guns melted down. And that's why whenever, there's always a question that I ask when somebody proposes a gun control question. I said, what problem do you think that will solve? Please be specific. And it's always those three words. If you guys, I always say, please be specific, because they will be vague and emotionally and all that kind of stuff. But if you're, okay, I understand that this is how you feel, but what specifically do you think that this bill will accomplish? And you can usually get to that. And if there's somebody who believes that all guns need to be melted down and turned into statues in the government square in Hennepin County, there's not really much reasoning with them. There's no point in having that conversation if they're willing to be that honest. And usually it only takes a couple of questions to find out that's what they want. So tell them, we need to do something about the gun deaths. Okay, how do you do that? Oh, we need to stop mass shootings. Okay, most mass shootings are done with guns that are bought legally. So what do you do about that? Well, they have to have background checks. Okay, those are already done. What's next? Well, maybe there needs to be fewer guns. We're getting warmer. Fewer guns. Okay, so then who gets to own guns? Find out who gets to own guns. Okay, well, just law enforcement. Why does law enforcement get the ability to defend themselves, but I don't have the ability to defend myself? You can get into these conversations, but eventually, if somebody is very much invested in the idea of gun control, it only takes a few questions to find out they just don't like guns and they want guns gone.
Rob, what if we started a charity and paid, got senior citizens shooting rounds at these ranges? Because we got this issue of them being kind of disenchanted and disenfranchised in our society. And they've got sons and daughters and grandchildren that would be pretty enamored to hear grandma and grandpa, whatever, shooting guns at the range. So the charity would be like to help pay for the rounds they shoot. Now, I'm sure there's no lack of people out there that would help kind of coach them through it. But the only people that hate guns are those that have never shot them.
So the question is, he's looking, what if there's some charity that can help elderly people, and I would assume other people who we'd want to get involved in the shooting sports. That is something that we actually do through our gun owner support fund. It's our connected support fund for the Caucus. That's what supported the Blame Trap team and things like that. There's a lot of great ideas, and I tell you, people bring me ideas all the time about things that we should be doing, and that is a good one. What I really need is people to say, hey, Rob, I've got this great idea, and I want to help do it. Because there's all kinds of really great things that we could do, but everything that we do as an organization takes time and it takes money. or in a broader sense, resources. So people, expenses, and things like that. So, I think that's a great idea. I think it's something that would fit well within our organizational values. But we need to make sure that we've got the time to do it and somebody to really back it up. And then we can use that to help get the resources.
One more.
I have a question for you, but it's rather sensitive nature. Can I speak to you after the meeting?
Sure.
You'll be around, won't you?
I have two things. One is an encouragement. I just recently helped out with 2 firearm safety classes. 36% of one class was women. One of them was 69 years old.
Awesome. In our hunter safety at 69.
48% were girls.
Excellent.
Now the other thing I want to talk about is words mean things. What is an assault rifle? People don't know.
Yeah, sometimes people think AR means assault rifle.
Well, just to be silly, if you hate scary black rifles, you must be a racist.
There you go. There's one more question here. Oh, sorry.
But the one thing I want to tell you, assault rifle. The U.S. Army defines assault rifles as short, compact, select fire. Okay? The most important one is select fire. Any firearm that is select fire is by definition a machine gun. All assault rifles are machine guns, but not all machine guns are assault rifles.
Right. Excellent.
That confuses you.
One other thing is, our Second Amendment was to protect us against a tyrannical government.
Yep.
And in the whole scheme of things, you talk about the people that are uninformed or those that just think they're icky and such. But I think there's an underlying force out there that's promoting all of this to try to take away our weapons. That's the key, I think, of all of this. It has nothing to do with a school shooting that gives them an excuse to try to grab our weapons. That's a tyrannical government trying to take over our Constitution, our rights. To me, that's number one on the list of what's happening in this country because it's happened all over the world. It just happened in New Zealand because of of course, fortunately, the New Zealanders didn't fall for it. But when the mosque shooting was just happened over there,
yep.
They tried to take their guns away. I think they gathered 4 or something.
Yeah. Yeah, lots of boating accidents in New Zealand right now with their firearms going overboard.
That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
There's a bigger picture on it.
That's Machiavelli. That's the whole idea about Machiavelli. There's a bigger force, and then all
Well, I think that you really brought up a good point. It is always a cultural shift, a change in values or understanding or knowledge, and we've got to bring it back into our homes, and we can do an awful lot. Again, take somebody out shooting or get involved in your local area with a high school.
Volunteer for a trap team.
Yeah,
always need coaches.
Help start one or support one and start getting your children involved. And if you don't have any of your own, grab your next door neighbor's kids. I mean, do something. But it really can make a huge difference, I think. Rob, I want to thank you so much for being here, and I know you'll stick around for a little bit.